Hello everybody and welcome to day 27 of climate change. Last time we were together we took a look at how we as people know things and what we can do with that knowledge. Today we're going to move forward and learn about how climate change impacts different people in different ways. Come on along, let's learn about climate justice. Our quote for today comes from Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, who says, "While the problem can sometimes seem overwhelming, we can turn things around. But we must move beyond climate talk to climate action." By the end of today, you will be able to explain what climate justice is, along with how climate change is expected to impact the migration of peoples. I want to start by taking us back to our first day of class, where we said that if our goal was to have societal success, we needed to have some balance between climate change action, and energy use, population, and consumption habits. And somewhere in there we can find a positive result. One thing that we did not talk about there is what societal success is and who that success is for. Up to this point in the class, we really haven't talked about things being right or wrong or good and bad. We've stuck to what we know about the science. Today, we're going to take a look at the impacts of that science and how that should cause us to act. A goal of ethics is to provide us with a language, a set of concepts, effective arguments, and a comprehensive vision whereby we can claim that some kinds of actions are right or wrong, and some forms of living are better or worse, perhaps independently of one's cultural or legal context. In 2012, I paddled a canoe down the Mississippi River, and in New Orleans, I went to the Audubon Aquarium of the Americas. And one of their main exhibits is the Gulf of Mexico. And when I walked in, the first thing that struck me was not the amazing fish and sand tiger sharks of the exhibit, but was the fact that it was sponsored by BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and others. This, of course, was 2 years after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And the question that really struck in my mind was, is this really a good idea to have this exhibit sponsored by these people? When we come to class, I'm going to break you up into groups, and I want each of your groups to discuss the ethical issues associated with a different scenario. People who use too much of the carbon dioxide absorption capacity of the world's oceans, vegetation, and soil owe a debt to all living creatures whose habitat is threatened. They owe a particular debt to the carbon creditors, the poor of the South who use less than their fair share of CO2 absorption capacity. The poor and indigenous people are among those who are likely to suffer the most severe effects of climate change. These consequences of global warming are another manifestation of environmental racism. We know that the people who are most affected by climate change are those who contributed least to its cause. So what is climate justice? We've talked about it a couple times. We mentioned it early in class with the quote from Mary Robinson. Well, climate justice begins with recognizing that key groups are differently affected by climate change. And many organizations are connecting civil rights to climate change. This includes the UN, the IPCC, the NAACP, and others. Climate change does not impact people equally. Men are impacted less than women. The oldest and youngest people are impacted more than people in their middle age. And people of color are the most influenced of all. Those most affected generally are the least responsible. Climate impacts can exacerbate inequitable social conditions that already exist. People of color are more at risk of air pollution. Seniors and people with disabilities have a harder time living through heat waves and evacuations. Subsidized housing is often located in floodplains. Language barriers make it harder for immigrant communities to get information about storms and wildfires. Indigenous communities lose lands, homes, and livelihoods to rising seas. Prolonged drought and flooding impacts food supplies for low-income people. Young people will live longer and therefore experience the worst effects of climate change. But momentum is building for climate justice solutions. The Climate Justice Alliance is working towards bringing race and gender to the center of the discussions. The NAACP advocates for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and clean air. The UN and the IPCC continue to put greater emphasis on these issues. I know I might not be the best person to be bringing the message of climate justice to you. However, it's a big reason why I ended up teaching this course. When I was an undergrad, I was working on a research project on amphibians in Nicaragua. And while I was there, in what was supposed to be the rainy season, it was dry. And I asked a mosquito man why it wasn't raining. And he said, "You don't know? It's climate change. Your people caused this, and now it's not raining here." And that conversation, the effects that had was the effects that was having on his crops and on the land there was really unfair. And the result is something that was completely not his fault, but something that he and his family and his community has to suffer. So these are things that should not and cannot be ignored. What makes somebody vulnerable to the effects of climate change more than others? Well, it has to do with risk, how likely they are to experience the effects of climate change, and their ability to adapt to those. Even for people who are experiencing the same risk of climate change, not everyone has the same ability to adapt. People with more human capital, people with more information, technology, material resources and infrastructure, organization, political capital, wealth, financial capital, highly functioning institutions and entitlements are able to adapt better. So when we look at who is at the most risk of climate change, we're looking at people who do not have these things. People who have high levels of exposure and low levels of coping ability. If we want to reduce the vulnerability of people to climate change, we have to identify points of intervention that will impact either their exposure or coping ability. Things that cause exposure are your natural and technological hazards. And I want us to be careful about thinking that climate change just has these natural hazards associated with it. Because if you have a natural hazard, it can result in a technological hazard as an effect. If you live in an area that has prolonged or extreme droughts, that place is more likely to end up in a state of unrest. Again, on that first day of class, we looked at the relationship between energy use and GDP. And we saw that they were directly proportional to each other. Because our energy use is so coupled with carbon at this time, we can see that the richest countries have the highest emissions. A person in the United States emits about twice the carbon emissions as a person in the United Kingdom, or Japan, or Korea. And if we look at the idea that those who have done the least to cause climate change are the most effective, we can look down here at this list of emissions all the way down to, at the lowest end of the list is Chad. So the country on this list that has the lowest emissions of climate change per capita is the same country that we were talking about having huge problems associated with their lake and economic activity drying up. What happens when your lake and your economic activity dries up? You get migration. And there's many different reasons that people can migrate. There's demographic drivers, there's economic drivers, social drivers, and political drivers. But there's also environmental ones. If you are a fisherman and the lake dries up and you have no other opportunities, migration becomes a strong possibility. Identifying the cause of migration for an individual can be hard. If you're involved in a conflict for resources, is that a political driver because there's a conflict, or is it an environmental driver because there's not enough water or food? This makes it very hard to determine the exact number of people who are actually displaced by climate change. When we think about putting forth a policy for migration and non-migration influenced by environmental change, we kind of need to think about three things at the same time. We need to reduce the influence of global environmental change on migration. We need to plan for and respond to migration that does occur in the context of global environmental change. And that we need to recognize that migration is an adaptation to global environmental change. People have always moved because of climate and weather events. Climate change has just made those events impact more people and occur more frequently. The Dust Bowl of 1930s America is a good example of this. Many Americans were forced to move from their homes as a result of crop failures, and when they showed up in other parts of their own country, they were viewed as outcasts and were not welcomed. 70 years after the Dust Bowl, Hurricane Katrina comes to New Orleans and creates a mass movement of people. Of course, Hurricane Katrina was not caused entirely by climate change, but climate change was one of the contributing factors to how bad the effects of it were. In another example of climate-induced migration within the United States, sea level rise and eroding coastlines have forced an entire community of indigenous people in Alaska to relocate. The people of Nuttuk did not want to leave their ancestral home, but were forced to create a new town, Merdavik, because their land was disappearing. 500,000 people live in the island nation of the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. And the Maldives is a country that is almost entirely below 2.5 meters of sea level. Facing repeated flooding and rising seas, the government of the Maldives decided that a good course of action would be to buy land in Australia and move their entire people to there. That plan has since been abandoned as tourist dollars have been shifted towards reinforcing and building up some of the islands. In this example, the City of Hope is growing out of the sea and it's being built up with seawalls around it that are 3 meters high, taller than any of the land within the island itself. Climate migration does not just impact small communities in Alaska and tiny island nations in the Indian Ocean. The country of Bangladesh has 161 million residents, and 80% of that land sits in a floodplain. Melting ice from the Himalayas is leading to increased riverbank erosion. Rising sea levels is causing saltwater intrusion, poisoning crops. And every year, more and more people are moving into the cities and out of the country. Different parts of the world will be influenced differently by migration and displacement of people. It's not just rising seas that cause migrations of people. Around the world, different environmental effects are causing that movement. This can be caused by decreased snow and ice cover, or increases in river runoff and water availability, or decreases in river runoff and water availability. More lands can be affected by droughts. There can be more intense precipitation patterns, ecosystem disturbances, decreases in crop productivity, and increase in erosion, flooding, and extreme storms. Climate-induced displacement is on the rise. And while it is difficult to measure the actual number of displaced people that are displaced because of climate change, it is estimated that somewhere between 150 and 200 million people will be forced to leave their homes as a result of these conditions by 2050. Climate migration does not just impact the people who are forced to move because of climate change. Climate migration is not always directly related to an event. It is not always a drought or a flood that causes movement. Large-scale human migration due to resource scarcity increased frequency of extreme weather events and other factors influence migration, particularly in developing countries and the Earth's low latitude band, where people are more vulnerable. Intensifying intra and interstate competition for food, water, and other resources, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, contribute. Climate change results in increased frequency and severity of disease outbreaks, such as dengue. In the United States, we can expect to see increased stress on our border due to severe effects of climate change in parts of Central America. When decisions are being made, ethics must be taken into account. Climate justice is a real concern. Those who have done the least to cause the climate crisis are the same people who are experiencing the worst of its effects. We should act to reduce harm caused upon these people who have done nothing wrong. Climate migration is occurring, and it needs to be addressed. If we do not address it, conflict will ensue. We should remember that no one wants to be displaced. Today, we covered a very small amount of some very big topics, but I really think that it's important for you to be exposed to these as you move forward in trying to understand what we should do about climate change. I hope you all are able to internalize this, take a deep breath, and go forth and act on it. We'll see you all tomorrow. Bye-bye, everyone.